Hello, my name is Lindsey, and on behalf of the team at Transforming Education, I would like to welcome you to the second in a series of 6 mini modules focused on SEL for educators. At Transforming Education, we focus on supporting schools, districts, and systems in integrating SEL and a whole child approach into their work. We work with partner organizations, leaders across the country to bridge the gap between research and practice, creating a bi-directional relationship between practitioners in the field and researchers, all with the intention of integrating and uplifting social emotional learning for students in school settings. Here, we're digging into SEL for educators, the adults in the school building. If you haven't checked it out yet, go back and look at the first mini module to get an overview on the why and the what of social emotional learning for educators. In this module, we're going to dive into one of the 5 high leverage practices that we have identified as the how. How do educators work on their own social emotional learning and well-being? And that's where we'll go today. So these are the 5 high leverage practices that we have identified coming out of a synthesis of comprehensive amount of research. So looking at research from across the field, we have identified these 5 high leverage practices as key ways that educators can improve their own social emotional learning and well-being that benefits their work in school settings. So today we'll talk about the first here on this wheel, examine identity. So why examine identity? Teaching and working in schools is inherently personal work. We're showing up in community every day, often for more waking hours than we spend in our own homes with our own families. Things may look a little different right now, but it is still to say that we often bring our whole selves into the school community the same way we want our students to do. But in order to understand that impact and the way in which our identity intersects with our work, it's important to go inward and examine the various pieces that impact all of our practice. So many educators who remain in the profession, research shows, after a while they start to struggle to engage with their initial values and purpose, asking themselves, why did I get into this? And losing touch with that original reasoning for going into this work. Therefore, it's important to take the time to self-reflect, revisit that why, and examine obstacles that are getting in the way. Additionally, educators are not immune to the unconscious biases and stereotype beliefs that are pervasive in society. By regularly examining the ways in which our identities, values, mindsets, biases, they all influence our actions, educators can more effectively show up and serve their students. So for each of our 5 high leverage practices, we've broken them down into some corresponding sub-strategies, some specific areas that people can work on to really benefit their own social emotional learning and the way in which they show up in the school setting. So for examine identity, we'll briefly look at defining values and pursuing purpose, investigating privilege and power, uncovering bias, and reflecting on work style. So starting with defining values and purpose. Research shows us that people who are resilient have a common trait. They have a clear sense of purpose. This clarity of purpose supports educators in working through challenging situations. If you can remember your why and really think about what is getting in the way, you're able to channel that energy and more effectively solve problems. So educators with clear values direct their work towards an intended purpose. And as mentioned, they're then able to identify the obstacles that inhibit their ability to pursue that purpose, and they work to find solutions to those obstacles. So again, reflecting, getting in touch with our values and our purpose can allow us to be more effective educators. Investigating privilege and power. So in order to create brave and safe spaces in classrooms, organizations, communities, and schools as a whole, it's crucial that we examine the ways in which power and privilege impact the systems in which we work, including our school buildings and our classrooms. Privilege is defined as a special right, advantage, or immunity available to a particular person or group. And having privilege conveys power. Both privilege and power are embedded in interactions and relationships, including those that occur in schools. Again, schools are not immune to the privilege and power dynamics that we see in the larger society. And so as educators, it's incredibly critical to think about what privilege we have that we are bringing into the school setting and what power we have. Similarly, by investigating our own privilege and power, we can look at the ways that that interacts with the identities, the privileges, and powers of those around us. Uncovering bias. Bias is defined as a natural inclination for or against an idea, object, group, or individual. As mentioned previously, educators are not immune to the unconscious bias that we see in the larger society. Bias can occur at any level, the individual, the system, and the societal level. And so individual educators and schools as systems are also impacted by bias. In schools specifically, research shows us that unconscious bias can lead to disparities in how students are treated through discipline policies, academic experiences, and adult expectations. It's the educators who work to uncover their own bias that are more likely to display confidence in and affirm their students. They also set high expectations for their students, and they support them in reaching their goals. Things we all strive for as educators, supporting students and helping them reach their goals. In order to do that, it's important to go inward and think about what biases we're bringing into the school setting and what we can do to tackle some of those biases. And the last sub-strategy for this category of examine identity is reflecting on work style. So reflecting on one's personality, work style, and leadership approach can really support self-awareness and identity development. Those who are self-aware are able to capitalize on their strengths and ask support where they need it. We all know that in school settings, whether in person or remote, it is critical to collaborate and be able to work together. This self-awareness on work style really enables educators to communicate challenges and seek support in order to strengthen team dynamics. So knowing that the same way we want students to know sort of the type of learner that they are, what are their strengths, where do they need supports, and how does that play into a larger group dynamic, the same is critical for educators, understanding those strengths and struggles, thinking about how that shows up in our work and how we can best do our work, improves not only the individual educator's experience, but also those team dynamics. So in recap, when we think about the high leverage practice of examine identity, we're thinking about defining values and pursuing purpose, investigating privilege and power, uncovering bias, and reflecting on work style. So if we take a moment to pause and process, how do you see your own identity showing up in your work as an educator? Thinking about intersectionality and all the pieces that make you you. How does that show up in your school, in your classroom, in your interactions with colleagues, students, and families? And of the 4 strategies that we outlined here, which do you feel you have done the most work on already? You feel pretty confident that that is an area you've committed some time and some self-reflection, and you feel pretty strong in that strategy. And then conversely, of the 4 strategies we outlined, which do you feel you could use some more focus on? Perhaps not only some time and energy to do the self-reflection, but maybe some additional support and some collaboration with others. Which of those strategies do you think you could commit to putting some more energy into? And so as we think back up to these 5 high leverage practices, this module really focused on just the tip of the iceberg of examining identity. We want to acknowledge that the SEL for Educators Toolkit is a broad overview of the extensive work that educators and school leaders need to do in order to best show up for their system, for their students and their systems. And this is, as I said, just the tip of the iceberg. In some of our corresponding resources, we support you in diving in deeper to do some of this internal work. And so you can learn more about examining identity, but also the other 5 high leverage practices by downloading our entire SEL for Educators toolkit. In that toolkit, you will have access to the professional learning presentation, a snapshot which summarizes the 5 high leverage practices, and a reference list of comprehensive resources that we consulted to really develop this tool. And lastly, what I want to highlight is it also comes with a companion guide. And it's in that companion guide where there are details about interactive components that you can use to really further your own learning. So we just briefly touched on and introduced this high leverage practice and corresponding strategies, but the companion guide will give you tangible ways to really dive into that examination of identity and really do the work. And so we have a number of other resources available to you in addition to the SEL for Educators Toolkit. We encourage you to check out our work at our website here, to subscribe to our newsletter or YouTube channel, and to follow us on social media. We welcome your feedback and questions. You can contact us at the email address here. And stay tuned for the 3rd mini module coming out soon, in which we will dive into the next high leverage practice for SEL for educators. Till then, take care.